Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. I'm your host, Ahmed Hassan. Today, as always, we have a very interesting guest. With me is Dave Luke. Dave is a friend and a business partner of mine. I know Dave a little bit more than most of the guests that I have on, but Dave is an information and strategy advisor. He has worked in more than 50 countries, including managing emergency missions in Africa and Middle East.
Yeah, it's funny hearing it read out to you. I think the simple way of summarizing that is a bit of an adventurous geek.
Yeah. Oh, that's really a good explanation at least from how I know you. If somebody asked me, explain Dave, I would, and I would have to do it in one sentence, and I would say eternally inquisitive.
I think first and foremost, my family would agree with you, and my girlfriend certainly would agree with you as well. Sometimes you can ask why one too many times.
So, as I said in the beginning, we know each other a fair bit. But Dave, where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, do you know, I had a really interesting conversation just a couple of weeks ago, and someone asked me a slightly different version of that question. It was like, what do you identify with? And I hadn't actually spoken to this guy for any more than like 10 minutes. I thought, that's a good question. So I'll answer your question and I'll sort of maybe major on identity. So originally I was born and bred in Northern Ireland, which in itself it gives you a bit of a potential identity crisis, but certainly makes you grow up and understand some of the trials and tribulations of culture and the world. So yeah, I did though leave Northern Ireland quite early. So I left at age 16 and went through, dare I said, a pretty stereotypical British institution, boarding school, university, ended up working with the British government. So where that's come around to now, people ask me like, who are you? Where are you from? I now say I started in Ireland and I've managed to have the privilege of sort of meandering around the world. But not to be too politically contentious, but I definitely grew up British, but I've become an Irishman. And that isn't just because my British passport isn't worth the paper it's written on compared to my fantastic Irish passport to allow me to travel the world and live in Europe unimpeded. I think it's just quite interesting about forming your identity, isn't it? So yeah, I think to answer your question directly, I'm from Northern Ireland, but being from Northern Ireland means you're, in my mind, equally British and Irish.
Okay. I think I recognize a lot of parallels with myself, being born in Somalia and moving as a little kid to the Netherlands, growing up there, but then not lived there since 2011. So that's a bit ago, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think that, pardon me for the people listening, the lame way to say it, we are citizens of the world, right? So, okay, you started off in Ireland, you became a Brit, and you joined the military. So how did that come about?
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, this idea of being an adventurous geek, I always sort of was interested in the rest of the world. And to keep it super simple, as a kid, one of the things I enjoyed most was actually spinning my elder sister's globe and stopping it with my finger and seeing if I knew that country or if I even knew that continent. And and still to this day, absolutely fixated with maps and globes. So, Ireland is an island. And if you speak to anyone who's lived in an island, you tend to go afar quite quickly. So, yeah, at that stage, as a young man, I pursued my education through the military. I think I was always going to look to go into further education, university and the like, and become some sort of professional, whatever that means. And then it just seemed that there was a bit of an opportunity to do that slightly earlier, maybe than expected. So I went into the military system at age 16 and came out age 30. With a 10-year commission service as a Royal Engineer officer, focusing actually quite a few different interesting things, from driving around in mini tanks, building bridges and doing fun stuff like that to start with. I ended up becoming a paratrooper, an army specialist diver, and I finished in the EOD and search world, heavily focused on counter improvised explosive devices, with a couple of tours in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Interesting. But okay, EOD. That's an area, and IED search.
Yeah.
That's an area. Obviously, you went further in. You started Artios Global. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually will take a step back if I can, Ahmed. When I was in Afghanistan, I ended up sort of working slightly outside of the engineering field and into what was, a vogue term at the time called stabilization, which was promoting either consent winning or rehabilitation and development activities with a military intent, but for what looked like development. And my job was actually to try and integrate and understand how the military operations in Afghanistan were either positively or affecting the civilian population, as I would have called it then. Now I've sort of grown up and I call it the normal people. But yeah, at that stage, I sort of got a bit of a taste for humanitarianism, stabilization. And, just to be quite simple, stabilization is the sort of provision of security and humanitarian effect at the same time. So it tends to be providing governance as well as some of the hard aid and maybe less hard security functions. So anyway, that whet my appetite. And the point there is it's relief. It's not, for me, it wasn't about guns, trucks, and, aggression in the military. I thought it was, as an engineer and as an engineering officer, it was all about supporting people to live, move, fight. And my real focus then was all about being able to understand how we could reduce risk of explosive hazards, how we could promote even prosperity within Helmand province in Afghanistan at that time. So not long after Afghanistan, sort of came back and actually specialized more and more into this world of explosive ordnance mitigation is another way of describing it. And interesting though, I quite quickly left the military after that because I decided stabilization, humanitarianism was what I wanted to do, and it wasn't sort of being in the military anymore. And I think someone once said to me, "What's the best decision you made in your life?" And I said, leaving the military to become myself. But interesting, the second best decision I ever made was joining it. So I don't begrudge it, and I'm proud of the person or the parts of me it has promoted, but I'm definitely as proud of the decade past it. But just to, stick on your line of questioning, I left that and actually went into slightly more emergency relief focus and ended up going straight into the Ebola response in West Africa. And at that stage, ran an emergency program for a public health agency where we actually framed and established one of the community level response programs for OFDA, which is the Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance for USAID, so the US Overseas Aid Program. And at that stage, people ask me, like, Dave, what do you know about public health? Well, not much, but luckily I had a fantastic team of specialists, and those specialists were doctors, entomologists, epidemiologists, absolutely, top of their game. And my role in that was to be a manager and a leader, to be able to corral their specialities and to run a program. The point of that is it was a very much technical intervention within an aid context. So I did that for a few years, actually. I ended up being the global ops director for a humanitarian relief organization, and just saw more and more again of there's a few things which I think have real impact within humanitarian affairs. One is public health, and the other is mine action. And mine action is the humanitarian terminology for dealing with explosive hazards in post-conflict scenarios. So in a weird set of circumstances, I was really, really enjoying being a pure blood humanitarian, and and purposely had stayed away from some of the more stereotypical sidesteps that an army officer would do in the, I don't know, management consulting, banking, security analysis, all that types of stuff. So I purposely stayed away from that, and actually went right the other way and became a yoga instructor while I was being a humanitarian response manager. But as I say, the moons aligned, and a very good friend back from Northern Ireland, he was out in Syria responding in line action. And we were at that situation, we're like, "Do you know what? Should we start our own organization?" And the aim was to make sure that we were just trying to support people to do their jobs as well as possible. We were both working for much larger organizations, and this is no slur on those organizations, but they seemed unfortunately burdened by having to maintain a certain volume of work so that they could sustain their businesses. And, myself and Mike, the other director at Artios, we decided, what we want to do? We want to start a sort of a technical assistance and advisory consultancy that could provide research, evaluation, and real niche technical assistance to concentrate on the more difficult, dare I say it, and more complex tasks, and be looking to the future. Little did I know Ebola would be, not the first public health issue we would deal with. If we think about the epidemic, but I then decided to start the business Artios with Mike. And over the last few years, we've really concentrated on sort of the forward edge of mine action, understanding how urban environments, complex environments, and then improvised explosive devices, as they have become the prolific weapon post-conflict rather than slightly more legacy traditional mine systems. So yeah, I mean, that was a meandering explanation, but point is we started Artios because we realized there was a few significant capability gaps within mine action. Our heart and souls saw that mine action, had real tangible effect to be able to release land and promote prosperity. And ultimately, back in 2015-16, there was, 2 or 3 conflicts in the world that were significant. Iraq, Syria, ISIS became a, arguably an existential threat to the world. So we focused on the hardest situation we possibly could and started business to try and do what we could.
That's super interesting. I mean, we talked very often, and I've never heard the origin story of Artios Global. So
Right.
so thank you for sharing that. So we know each other mainly from research and intelligence. And I'm not saying it's a pivot, but how did that became a pretty solid pillar of Artios Global?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I think if I can, again, just take it one step back. I absolutely love information. Like, absolutely love it. And I love people. So that's there for relationships. Sort of my primary academic background was in communication, information, systems management, which is a mouthful, but that's like data bits. Technically, how does information move around within telecommunications? But it's also then how people want to communicate an idea. So I have had that as a thread of how I think and act all the way along. And ultimately, all situations, whether they be, in the old days, understanding a situation, military intelligence, intelligence preparation of the environment, all of that, which I had a good focus and a good schooling on, matched with this information and information science technicality that I had academically. Point of all of this rests on, if you do not understand the context of a situation, you can't assess it. So, and if you make it even a little bit more geeky, there's problem definition, or there's the problem space in any scenario, and there's the solution space. If you do not define a problem, state it, and structure it effectively, you have no hope of identifying possible solutions which you can grade and then potentially test before you then sell or scale that solution to the problem. So research for me could be called intelligence. It could be called information gathering, but ultimately research in itself is generating new knowledge, understanding and defining problems such that you can then start to attempt to apply the right solutions. So for me, it's a natural and critical element of the business that we understand how we work, how our customers, beneficiaries, affected populations, whatever terminology you want to use, what they need. So research could also be termed a needs assessment, a context assessment, or a technical assessment. So another example of that, if I may, is over the last couple of years, we actually started to provide a unexploded ordnance risk assessment, but not overseas, specifically for the construction sector in the UK. So it is a desktop research product, which we then provide as an assessment prior to construction. So if knowing, understanding, context assessment, I think is interwoven through all activities.
Very true. All right. So that's what you're doing right now, or one of the many things that you're doing right now. How do you see the future for Artios Global? What's something you would like to do? What do you think you're going to do? What are you focusing on in the immediate future and more like longer term?
Yeah, so maybe just pick up, where I left off. So, I mean, to be quite clear, the organization, so as you said, as you know, it's split into a few different pillars where we have we're in a fantastically privileged position to have a few on our team who are genuinely global specialists within different parts of explosive ordnance mitigation, and they provide very niche advisory and capacity development programs to governments, to international institutions, to other larger NGOs, other larger commercial organizations. So, they said, once again, we're the geeks in the room, but we're quite adventurous. So we get our hands dirty, we get sand between our toes all the time, but we bring very specialist experience and capabilities. And we focused on complex environments, urban environments, and IEDs. So we actually have been part of a core group within Mind Action who have been framing and establishing how to actually conduct improvised explosive device, either disposal or management, depending on the terminology you want to use. So we've effectively proved concept at the policy level. We've helped generate good practice guides for the practice level. And now what we want to do is support other organizations in scaling this capability across the whole of the sector. So it's, it's actually, you could look at it across an innovation or even a product development scaling strategy. Hit the policy, hit the product development, and then iterate until you have a series of different training programs, policy documents. You actually push it out into the sector and get some real work done. An example of that, actually, we've been working in Afghanistan for the last few years, pre and post the Taliban situation. And there we helped one of the key organizations, the Halo Trust, help them understand the effects of improvised explosive devices and then help them frame and conceptually frame how to support the Afghan organizations in dealing with this real threat to life. So I spent the last 3 years on and off now, either in Afghanistan or remotely teaching Afghan organizations and people how to deal with improvised explosive devices. Initially teaching them, training them, and then going out and mentoring them on site so that they have a reliable and sustainable capability to the capacity to deal with it themselves. So doing that in other theatres is exactly what we want to do. And concurrent to that is to really grow some of the research focuses that we have, both in Mine Action and wider. And say one of those, which is really going quite well, is the unexploded ordnance, UXO, the risk assessments for that for the construction industry. And again, the consistent theme or the golden thread throughout this is us being able to really understand, listen, research situations, give technical and reliable advice to either organizations to deal with it themselves or to inform a program design, and then us either deliver some capacity development and mentoring ourselves or to give recommendations for other larger organizations to take that on.
Super interesting. I think I'm just finding the words how to describe this, but every person that I've spoke to in the podcast, but also people that, friends and people that I work with and people that I respect for what they do and how they do it, I think pretty much all of them have this talent that might not always be described as I'm about to do. Is I think something, and I think you are really, really good at it, is you know how to tell a story. And I think it's woven into pretty much everything you do. And I think I don't want to be facetious about this, but I think it's very important that you can make concepts simple and get at the heart of problems. And the reason why I'm going on onto this is that we can circle back, but you're also very involved in documentary filmmaking with your other company, Black Bay Media. So am I barking up the wrong tree here about the storytelling part, or is there something that goes as a red thread through your life?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, and I pride myself on communication. I think my friends, loved ones, and colleagues will maybe disagree about simplifying situations, and in fact, a lot of the time, I confuse everybody with all the different directions and questions, and I will pride myself on not being linear in process or thought. But if you stick with it, it becomes a story. And I think you're right there. So, when people say, hey, what do you do? Or describe yourself, I say, I focus on strategy, information, and communication. And ultimately, if you cannot communicate what you're thinking, or if you cannot communicate with people to understand and to really interrogate in the nice sense, not the CIA sense, what they are trying to say. And that for me is a skill. So information comes from telling a story, but also listening. And the key here is anyone who can tell a good story or maintain a good conversation, it isn't just about projecting, it's about listening. And I think that's the key. Is I've had people talked about it, sort of a mosaic of a professional profile over the last 20 years. But the consistent theme has been obsession with information, obsession with people, and asking why. And the core to all of this, the red thread, should be a green thread. An Irishman can tell a bloody story. So I have an unfair advantage.
Yeah. I say this also because you said something about everybody in the beginning getting confused. And I think also because it's the way most people think is very linear.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you are very non-linear.
Yeah.
And sometimes you start talking about something and I know what you're like getting after, right? So I was like, let him go, because I know where he's going with this. But you know that, and this is not to blow smoke, but you know the scene in the second Batman movie, the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, where they introduce the Joker.
Okay.
right? So all right. So in the first scene of the movie, they introduce a Joker, and he does a very chaotic bank heist, and that's even before the credits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in any good storytelling, you set the tone immediately, where most people go into backgrounds and history, and right, and that's something you do. You go into the heart of the problem, and sometimes people are like, yeah, but that's not where it started, or that's not, that's not how it's done. And I think that's so important in not just storytelling, but in problem solving, right? So that in that regard, I'm saying you're a version of Christopher Nolan. That's what I'm getting.
Yeah, so I read that or heard that as I am the Joker. I'll take that. So no, it's funny you say that, because I think it's really important, and I will have to say I struggle sometimes to be succinct. I struggle to just be even empathetic with other people in groups, because I'm like, right, I think this is what we need to talk about. And I have really tried, again, to just get that point of actively listening, because I do, it sounds a little bit arrogant, but I do think quickly. And I used to assume thinking quickly was good, but it's not, because it's actually lazy thinking, because you're probably basing on heuristics, and my brain's doing loads of shortcuts to what it wants to do. There's probably a load of ego on my shoulder about me wanting to project whatever it is. So I think to your point there, it's taken a long time, and I get it wrong all the time, to be able to not interrupt, to listen to people, and actually not just listen, but appreciate what they're saying. And I was on a mountain bike ride just yesterday, listening to a podcast about how to have good conversations. And one of the key takeaways from it is some form of, forgive the inaccuracy, Chinese proverb about how you listen with your ears, you listen with your eyes, you listen with your heart, and you listen with your soul. And, I'm sure some behavioral scientist could deconstruct that and tell us what that actually means in scientific terms. But I thought it was fantastic, wasn't it? So it's about empathy, sympathy, nonverbal behavior, and actually listening. And, just to focus on the point you were making there, it's very easy to project. It's very easy to come up with an idea, especially if you've worked in certain fields at certain times. And dare I say, a lot of the work that we do, either together or in different fields, it's driven by timelines. It's driven usually by relatively limited resources. So you have to be quite results focused. And there's a real caution I would give that jumping to solutions, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but I effing hate when people come up with a solution before we've actually defined the problem and structured and how we're going to make a decision on it. Because if not, you're throwing mud at a wall. And, if I want to make it slightly more theoretical, too often I happen upon people who are supplying what they want to say, supplying their solution, when what we need to do is to react to demands. And, you've got to have a demand needs driven product or service to be a successful business. At a slightly more macro level within humanitarian affairs, we are, as a fraternity, trying to drive a localization agenda where it's actually the affected populations are demanding, in the economics sense, what they need, not being told by outsiders. Yeah. So it's a balance of wants and needs. But the critical element here is demand-driven services based on research, assessment, and understanding.
Right. Yeah. Really well said. I think I just mentioned it before, but I know you're working on different projects, but where did the documentary filmmaking come from? How did Black Media get born, and what's the genesis of that?
Yeah. So again, go back to this adventurous geek. I said I'm absolutely obsessed with people, obsessed with other cultures, but will happily admit to been given quite a few opportunities as I've grown up by my parents, by the system in inverted commas. But dare I say, I took them and ran with them hard. So I've traveled all of my life, and then that manifested actually in traveling with purpose. And that purpose was usually on expeditions to climb mountains. And, I'm sat here tonight in a Chamonix in France at the foot of Mont Blanc. And that's because, mountains energize me. So, having an overseas perspective, having an attempt to be as culturally aware as possible has meant that all I've ever wanted to do was travel abroad. So at Black Main, our focus is overseas travel exploration documentaries. Where it came from was a sort of back to one of my biggest prides in life is having, a few friends who I really trust, and they really, really trust me. And that's back to the point of having a passion or obsession for people, and that's about relationships. Trust for me is absolutely essential. I mean, it's amusing actually. I heard an anecdote about a year ago now, where there's a German saying that trust is okay, but control is better. And I don't know if that's the exact description, but it's something along those lines. But for me as a person, I've actually gone the other way over the last decade, where I openly trust people and are super inclusive. And that's promoted the communication element that you have talked about. And ultimately, it's promoted respect for others. So with that, as an ethos, it's maybe a way of describing it. I've always wanted to travel, see stories, and tell stories. But again, another opportunity came along where a very good friend of mine, called Lev Wood, who's now become sort of, a UK famous explorer, fantastic author, and has fronted quite a few award-nominated documentaries, both in the UK and abroad. We've been good friends since 2005. Maybe sounds like a bit of a stereotype, both paratroopers together, and then sort of reunited as he left the military and went into media. I was going to do emergency response at the time, but he gave me a phone call and he was like, you know what, we're doing some really good stuff and I could do with some sort of trusted people around. Come and give me a hand. And I was like, sorry, mate, I'm saving lives. This is absolutely fantastic. I found my calling. And he's like, look, this is getting bigger. He'd just done a world first of walking the length of the entire of the River Nile. And this had literally propelled him to, exploration stardom with, from Michael Palin to, Bear Grylls and all of these different comparisons. And a funny story here is I remember coming back from leading an expedition back onto the Strand in London and walking into a shop and seeing a cardboard cutout of Lev. Like, I texted him, I was like, dude, what is happening? Why did I see a life-size version of you in the middle of a shop? And he's like, yeah, the TV is going really well. And again, it's a few months after that when I was back in London at LSE, just off the back of the Ebola response. It gave us a chance to reconnect because he was back from Africa. I was back from Africa. I was at that stage starting up Artios, and he's like, come and give us a hand with one of these TV bits and you can be the location manager. I'm like, what the F is a location manager? He's like, just come and be. He's like, just come and get shit done. Like you normally do. You never fail to follow through. You always get stuff done. And I was like, okay, cool. So the next thing you know, fast forward 3 months, I'm swinging a hammock in the deepest depths of Panama, in the jungle, in the Darien Gap. And we're trying to cross the Darien Gap, which is arguably one of the most challenging jungle environments in the world. And this is going to be, a world first on TV. And I'm half, I should say more than half. Obviously focused on looking after the team, managing the expedition, looking after the TV crew, but also writing my bloody dissertation in the hammock at night because I still was in the middle of my master's. And it was like one of these situations that Led's got me into over the last 2 decades of, come and just give us a hand with this. And then it snowballs. But at that time, we were working with different organizations and we did 2 or 3 really good shows. But I sat actually in back end of 2016, early 2017. We were both in Washington, D.C. at a kind of movie conference called Real Screen. And we were at the National Geographic office drinking champagne and eating oysters. And we looked at each other and like, you know what? Why don't we just, again, the same genesis as me and Mike, why don't we do this ourselves? Well, why don't we do it as well as possible? And why don't we make an attempt? You know, it sounds cliche to like, you know, nudge the needle or, you know, push forward a sector. But both Artios and both Black Men have the same drive, not just do stuff which is good enough or run of the mill, which is world first, which is genuinely impactful, which is actually supporting people, educating people, or exposing them to issues. And, you know, the TV side, there's an engagement element to it, there's an education, and there's an entertainment side of it. But ultimately, you know, you're making people smile, which is really interesting and satisfying. So yeah, we off the back of that, we're like, right, let's start a TV production company. It's a bit like arriving in Ebola in West Africa as all the other NGOs are flying out. How hard can it be? Well, like Ebola, like I can tell you now, starting up or scaling an organization in a humanitarian disaster is not far off trying to run 2 small companies here in the UK. But yeah, 2017, decided to start the company yourself. And at that stage, I did a little bit more work for other production companies, different channels, and then decided to basically weave together 3 or 4 of the most iconic expeditions of all time. And we circumnavigated the Arabian Peninsula over 14 countries, 14,500 miles, 6.5 months. And we made a documentary called Arabia with Levison Wood, which, as I say, consisted of us hitchhiking out of Syria, rolling into battle on a tank with ISIS, crossing the empty quartered desert, getting thrown out of Yemen, hitching a ride across the Gulf of Aden to Somalia, to be very quickly escorted out of the country and over to Somaliland, to then be rescued by a very good friend who took us in for a couple of days. Next thing you know, we're in Djibouti. And then back we go across to Saudi Arabia, into Jordan, up into Lebanon, and back to Syria through Palmyra. So we did a full circumnavigation of the entire of the peninsula and filmed it. And, you know, it's stuff, it's a challenge, it's risk, it's complexity, which other people just weren't willing to take on. But like most things, if you apply grit, a good bit of, you know, whether intelligence or process, you can probably achieve stuff, but you've got to back yourself. You've absolutely got to back yourself. And don't get me wrong, there's been many a night where we've been rolling our eyes thinking, Jesus Christ, what are we doing here this time? Anyway, there you go. We did that. And, you know, lo and behold, Arabia was nominated as the best documentary in the UK in 2020. Unfortunately, we didn't win. But since that, you know, a bit of a lull period during COVID, because, you know, we wouldn't want to be doing too much overseas filming if it wasn't in a responsible manner and the different restrictions of the COVID. But yeah, there you go. That's how it happened. Once again, a friend asking for help and deciding that we could, I mean, not do it a bit better, but, you know, making sure we could tell good stories, access the inaccessible stories, and just expose the absolute beauty of human beings and the environment as much as possible.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, I remember when you told me about it, you did that. And this was after, you know, we talked about the stabilization and security and all that stuff that we were working on. And I saw the documentary and I watched all the episodes. I was like, the story and the journey is already crazy enough. But how did you guys make it look so good at the same time too? Because it looks so slick.
Yeah. Well, I mean, down to that, we've got a fantastic team of some of the best producers, directors, series producers in the UK. And I say team of, we have good friends. You go through these things, and it is a small, tight team of trusted individuals that we've grown over the last 5 to 7 years, and everyone's really good at what they do. So back to the question you asked a few minutes ago, they are, and this is something I'm brutally jealous of. I can tell a story by understanding the situation and writing a narrative. I can verbalize a narrative, but their gift is that comprehension and then communication via either photography or video. And, what you were alluding to, what I thought you were alluding to, was like how this sort of the mosaic pieces together. It's still about engaging with humans as a human, listening, documenting that situation as accurately as possible, and then maintaining a narrative and communicating it to the correct individual in the correct manner.
That's creativity, right?
Yeah, on the one hand, there's creativity, but it's also process and perfectionality. So the creativity side, absolutely, like the magic I've seen the team, Neil is our creative director, and I see the story, I hear what the people are saying, so I try to support him to be like, that's the genesis of what's trying to be said, but his gift to be able to capture that and to blend together the different picture and image elements. And then, as you say, make it look cinematic when he's literally sweating from every corner of his body, being shot at, or whatever it is, ridiculous thing that we've got ourselves involved in. Yeah, I mean, that is a gift. It's like, you and I do a lot of research together, which is great. And the key, speaking to people is fun. Speaking to people for an output of being able to have a structured conversations to deliver a consolidated information or body of evidence is a skill set. Communicating that either in written form or in visual form, that's the gift. And that is where the creativity comes in. Be able to understand an audience and to be able to really, really have the empathy where you have people engaged throughout. And there's one thing I've learned over the last 3 or 4 months, actually. There's a real humbleness to how to tell a story. And it's not to tell it as technically as you can in written form, as, with the wildest vocabulary. It's not a competition to show how well read you are. It's about saying it as simply as possible, but doing it justice. If there's a level of technicality, keep it there. But what you don't want to do is actually distract people by putting in your whatever the buzzword of the day is at the worst case, or best case using a overly technical terminology. But actually, the emphasis here started with the movie side of things. There's so many techniques you can do. The gift is keeping the viewer locked into the story, keeping them engaged. If you take them out of the story, you need to transition them elsewhere straight away. So how you write a narrative and actually how you collect or film the movie is, very, very similar. You need to keep people engaged throughout, and it's exceptionally challenging to do so. Special effects distract people. Moving cameras, drone shots, all of this, you can piece it all together. But to have it as one clean narrative with a start, middle, and end, a research paper has a start, middle, and end. Churchill said, tell them what you want to say, said, and say it again. Same TV, start, middle, end. And it's a real gift. And sometimes I wonder if I even have it for writing, just to keep people engaged.
If I'm a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, and I just finished school, or I'm about to finish school and I want to go into the wide world, even younger than that, what piece of advice would you give if somebody wants to come into this, I don't know if I can say industry, but into this world of research and storytelling? Let's call it that.
Well, I think the simplest thing is maybe to break those down. So first and foremost, ask for help. Like, no ifs, no buts. Find someone close to you that might know someone else, and just use the network effect. Yeah. Don't be shy. Just ask yourself that question. What's the worst that could happen? It's a bit of a Timothy Ferrisism. He says it all the time, but what is the worst that can happen? Ask for help, ask questions, and that then leads to put yourself out there. So look for opportunities, and don't be afraid, as I say, of asking or looking for an opportunity. But the key is recommendations, and I think that's how I've been, on a personal level, been really lucky over the years to have, we'll call them mentors, guardian angels, whatever cliche we want to go. People are like, Jesus, do you know what, Dave? I might just back you in this one. So therefore, it's about developing. People talk about networking. It's about developing, for me, emotional intelligence to match vocational skill or academic qualification. So, it's about, I think the key there is like developing a network, connections, contextual understanding, as well as a skill set. So and I'll focus on mind action to start with. If you want to be a technical operator where you're dealing with the devices, there's some very structured training programs and qualifications through the International Mine Action System standards. So there's a system of the International Mine Action standards where you will get, literally skill and technique training, how to deal with explosive devices. And that's a very good, tangible entry point. If you want to look at the slightly more research, evaluation, looking at accountability to affected populations and that community engagement element, well, then again, there are not barriers to entry, but there's an assumption you will have certainly as call it an expat on a program, you would be a university graduate in an appropriate field, and that appropriate field could be anything from social sciences through to project management or the like. So while that's not a direct, it's like really, really simply get out there, get experience, and do that by milking your network. And if you don't have a network, Google a company that you Google it. Look for a few companies in your locality, and you know what? Email the CEO. Don't mess about with anyone else. Email the CEO. Phone the CEO. Tell them your story. Don't presume anything. Just be like, I am Ahmed. I've just finished at high school. I've got a summer. I'd love to learn. I remember a few years ago, I was listening to a podcast. There's a consistent theme here. I cycle around an awful lot and listen to an awful lot of podcasts. So none of these are my ideas. I'm just savagely recycling smarter people than my ideas, but just hopefully put them in the right context. And it was about the hiring policy of Google, and it was about potential and enthusiasm. So they stopped hiring for technicality. Yeah. Attitude is key. Yeah. Attitude is learned, and attitude can grow. Skills are easy to acquire. It just takes time. Attitude. And for me, it's about I'm stating this now from another book, a guy called Daniel Pink talks about how you promote, communicate, and sell yourself. And he talks about attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. So before you communicate to the CEO of that organization, think, who is he? What do they do? And what might you be able to offer? Go there, buoyant. Go to 10 of the organizations. Realize you will get knocked back. But hey, that's how you learn. And then when you do have the conversation, be really clear of what you could offer, or better, what you want out of the situation. And that boils down to just be honest. And don't be scared to just ask.
Yeah.
Or you could go to university, listen to all the university lectures, go to a load of trade shows, listen to all these other people. I don't know. I would say own your own destiny. No one owes you anything.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. I think even for me, the people that I've hired, I always say this. I rather hire somebody who loves what we do and follows what we do than somebody who comes from a top school and knows how to write proper. On your point of enthusiasm, I wanted to comment on a couple of things you said. Just a quick one. You said that you take these ideas and from other smart people, but I've always learned that ideas don't belong to anybody. Ideas are just there, right? And if you're just at the right wavelength, you will pick them up, or you don't. But that's on the ideas point. And I wanted to comment on your networking, and that's how we got to know each other. I always tell people, grow your tribe. Your tribe, you start with your family and your friends that you grew up with, and grow your tribe. I mean, that's my mantra at least. But Dave, thank you so much. I know, me and you, we talk. Well, when we talk a lot, and bizarre concepts and very esoteric conversations. But I always like to close off with asking 2 questions. Sometimes it's 3. The first one is, what are you reading right now? If you are reading something.
Hey. So,
all right, there we go. What are you listening to then?
Not really. So, yeah, audio books wise, there's it's a podcast series, to be more accurate, and it's called The Uphill Athlete, and it's considering conditioning and endurance programs for mountain-based sports. That's what I was on first thing this morning, and then later in the afternoon, I was Squared podcast, which I do quite like. There is maybe that actually. Do you know what? I'll answer your question really directly. What am I reading right now? Should be, what have I been trying to read non-stop for the last 2 or 3 years, but will never finish the bloody book, but I'm obsessed with it. There's a book called Flow, Flow, by, forgive the horrific pronunciation, Mikhail Kaczynski, I think, or something along those lines. And it just talks about the pursuit of happiness and a higher human performance. And that's, I think it's a really interesting book. Takes you a few different reads of it at different times in your life. Two listens
anything
and one
you're
read.
watching? Just for the fun of it, even, not even something.
Yeah, do you know, I'm not that much of a TV watch. I'm trying to think. I've been doing quite a bit of travel over the summer for work, and I'm trying to think of some movies that I enjoyed. I actually watched a movie which was called The House of Gucci, and it's all about the background Italian clothing stroke a fashion brand. But there's a little bit of sort of dark twist humor involved in that, that's definitely. And I watched. Oh, this is actually quite good. Oh, look at this! Got the name now. The one with Leonardo DiCaprio in New York in the sort of swinging 20s. Oh, the Fantastic Mr. Great Gatsby. Yeah. So I watched the Great Gatsby as well. I thought that was another amusing one. And another very interesting one I watched was actually called The Contractor, which is all about a contractor who had just come out of the US Special Forces with an injury, but had then taken steroids to overcome his injury, but had got a dishonorable discharge. And then it got seduced into the mercenary contract in Germany. So that was another one of those ones where you like thank yourself for making good decisions to not go down those routes.
Yeah. With Chris Pine is that one, right?
Is it? Yeah,
In the lead.
I can't remember, but it was one of those ones that was quite fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dave. There's one thing. It's not a piece of advice, it's not a question. It's just a comment on who Dave is for people listening. One of the most, like, I was like, that's Dave. I remember you and I were supposed to talk, and we were messaging each other, and you were like, what are you up to? And I said, well, I'm just, doing some research. And I was like, what are you up to? And you were like, I'm doing yoga while watching Citizen Kane. Do you remember that?
I don't, but yeah.
So that was like, that's a typical Dave sentence. So, but yeah, Dave, thank you so much for doing this. I know we tried to do it.
Yeah, it's been a
while.
Yeah, that's it. We've been juggling all sorts, but yeah, cool. Yeah, give us a shout, and looking forward to the next conversation or the next bit of work together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dave. Have a good one for everybody listening. Thank you guys for joining us. I know we missed last week. I've been traveling, so forgive me for that. And I hope to see you guys next week. And if you have any questions or whatever, you heard what Dave said, send the CEO a message or an email. So that's an open invitation right there, I think.
Let's see. Cheers, man. Have a good evening.
All right. Take care. Cheers.